Labeled an ugly high school grad and disowned by my family, 11 years later I met them at my sister's wedding. Her husband asked, "You know her?" I said, "More than you think." My name is Sophia Bennett, and I hadn't seen my family in 11 years. Not since they kicked me out at 21, stealing my college fund to send my perfect sister Claire to Stanford. They called me the family disappointment, the ugly duckling who'd never amount to anything. What they didn't know was that I'd just signed a $400 million acquisition deal for my medical technology company the week before. I could have skipped Claire's wedding entirely, could have stayed in my penthouse, focused on my business empire, continued living my successful life without them. But when that ivory invitation arrived at my corporate headquarters, addressed to the CEO of Medova Technologies, I realized they had no idea who they'd thrown away. So I showed up, not for revenge, not for validation, but because I wanted to see who my sister had become with all the advantages I'd been denied. What I discovered would destroy not just her marriage, but expose a web of lies that had been 11 years in the making. Because sometimes the family disappointment becomes the family's biggest success story, and sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing at the worst possible moment. Parte 2, 4,500 plus parole. What I discovered about Claire's education in the next 30 minutes would unravel 11 years of carefully constructed lies. The cocktail hour was in full swing when I made my way to the bar. The wedding was everything I'd expected from Claire. Elegant, expensive, and designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a masterpiece of white roses and baby's breath that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I ordered a gin and tonic and positioned myself where I could observe without being obvious. The guest list was exactly what I'd imagined. Mom and Dad's country club friends, colleagues from Dad's law practice, and what appeared to be Daniel's entire extended family. Everyone looked successful, polished, the kind of people who'd never questioned Claire's version of her perfect life. "Sophia?" A familiar voice made me turn. Janet Morrison, who'd been Mom's closest friend since college, was staring at me with poorly concealed shock. "My goodness, is that really you?" "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," I said, extending my hand with a polite smile. "It's wonderful to see you again." She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored dress, my professional makeup, the confidence that 11 years of success had given me. The last time she'd seen me, I'd been a scrawny 21-year-old with braces and an attitude problem, loading my few possessions into a beaten-up Honda. "You look incredible," she said, clearly struggling to reconcile her memories with reality. "What are you doing these days?" The question that would start unraveling Claire's carefully constructed narrative about her family. "I run a medical technology company," I replied casually. "Medova Technologies. We develop diagnostic equipment for hospitals." Janet's eyes widened. "Medova? That's the company that just revolutionized cardiac monitoring systems. I read about it in Forbes last month. You're telling me you work there?" "I own it, actually," I said, taking a sip of my drink. "Founded it 7 years ago." The silence that followed was profound. Janet stared at me like I'd announced I was secretly royalty. "But Claire always said—" she started, then stopped, confusion clouding her features. "She said you were struggling, that you'd made some poor choices after college and were having a hard time finding your footing." "After college?" I raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Morrison, I never went to college, at least not initially. My parents used my college fund to send Claire to Stanford, remember?" Janet's face went pale. "That's not— Claire said you chose not to go to college, that you were rebellious and wanted to do your own thing." The first crack in Claire's carefully constructed story, but what came next would show how deep the lies went. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared beside us, his arm sliding around my waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. I'd only introduced him to Janet as my husband without elaborating, and I could see her brain working to process this new information. Ladies, Daniel said with his charming smile, I hope you don't mind if I steal my wife away. There are some people I'd like her to meet. Janet nodded mutely, still staring at me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. As Daniel guided me toward a group of his medical colleagues, he leaned down to whisper in my ear. That looked intense. Everything okay? Just catching up on old times, I replied. Mrs. Morrison seemed surprised by some of the details of my life. We approached a cluster of men in expensive suits, all holding whiskey and discussing what sounded like golf scores. Daniel's hand on my back was warm and steady, a reminder that I wasn't facing this alone anymore. Gentlemen, Daniel announced, I'd like you to meet my wife, Sophia Bennett. She's the CEO of Medova Technologies. The reaction was immediate and telling. Dr. Harrison, Daniel's department head, nearly choked on his drink. Medova? You're Sophia Bennett? My hospital just purchased 3 of your cardiac monitoring systems last month. The efficiency improvements have been remarkable. Dr. Williams, a cardiologist I recognized from medical journals, stepped forward with obvious excitement. Ms. Bennett, I've been following your company's work for years. The innovation in non-invasive diagnostic technology is revolutionary. How did you transition from traditional medical training to technology development? The question hung in the air, and I realized this was a perfect opportunity to let the truth speak for itself. Actually, I said, I don't have traditional medical training. My background is in biomedical engineering and computer science. I taught myself most of what I know about medical applications through research and working directly with healthcare professionals. Dr. Harrison looked impressed. Self-taught? That's even more remarkable. Where did you do your undergraduate work? MIT, I replied. Full scholarship for academic excellence. I completed my bachelor's in 3 years while working part-time to support myself. The pride in my voice was unmistakable, and Daniel squeezed my hand supportively. 3 years at MIT while working? Dr. Williams shook his head in amazement. That's incredibly impressive. Your parents must have been so proud. The comment hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. My parents and I had different visions for my future, I said diplomatically. Daniel shot me a look that said he understood exactly what that meant. He'd heard the whole story during our early dating days, had held me while I cried about the family that threw me away. Well, Dr. Harrison said, raising his glass, their loss is the medical community's gain. Medova's technology is saving lives every day. As the conversation continued, I noticed Claire approaching our group. She looked stunning in her wedding dress, a vision in white silk and lace that probably cost more than most people's cars. But there was something in her expression, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with what she was seeing. What Claire did next would reveal just how threatened she felt by my presence. Sophia! She exclaimed with forced brightness, inserting herself into the circle with the practiced ease of someone used to commanding attention. I see you've met my husband's colleagues. The doctors turned to greet the bride, offering congratulations and compliments on the beautiful ceremony. Claire basked in the attention, but I noticed her eyes kept darting back to me, calculating. I was just telling everyone about Sophia's company, Daniel said proudly. Did you know your sister runs a medical technology empire? Claire's smile faltered for just a moment. Oh, yes, Sophia's always been entrepreneurial, though I'm not sure empire is quite the right word for a small tech startup. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable, and it revealed everything about how Claire saw me. Dr. Harrison looked confused. Small startup? Mrs. Parker, Medova Technologies employs over 800 people and has an annual revenue of $400 million. They're one of the fastest-growing companies in the medical technology sector. The color drained from Claire's face. 400 million? This year's projections are actually closer to 500 million, I said quietly. We just closed a major acquisition deal with a European diagnostics company. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stared at me, like I'd grown a second head, while Daniel's colleagues looked between us with growing confusion. Dr. Williams, apparently oblivious to the tension, continued enthusiastically. Your sister is being modest, Mrs. Parker. Madova's innovations in cardiac diagnostics have revolutionized emergency medicine. She's probably saved more lives than most doctors. If you're loving this moment where Sophia's success is finally recognized, absolutely smash that like button. And make sure to subscribe, because what happens when Claire's lies start unraveling is absolutely mind-blowing. Claire forced another smile, but I could see her mind racing. That's wonderful, Sophia. I had no idea your little computer business had grown so much. Computer business? Dr. Harrison looked puzzled. Ms. Bennett, didn't you say you studied biomedical engineering? I did, I confirmed. At MIT. Graduated summa cum laude. Claire's face went white. MIT? But you never... When did you go to MIT? The question revealed everything. If Claire had been telling people I'd never gone to college or had struggled academically, then my MIT education was news to her too. I started the year after you went to Stanford, I said calmly. Full academic scholarship, plus a research assistantship that helped cover living expenses. Daniel was watching this exchange with growing interest, his medical training making him naturally observant of behavioral cues. I could see him noting the inconsistencies, the way Claire's story didn't align with the evidence standing right in front of her. Stanford, Dr. Williams said, turning to Claire with renewed interest. What was your major there? Always curious about interdisciplinary families. The question that would begin Claire's downfall. Claire hesitated for just a moment too long. Oh, I studied liberal arts. Very broad curriculum. Not as focused as Sophia's technical background. Liberal arts at Stanford, Dr. Harrison mused. Excellent program. Did you work with Professor Richardson in the philosophy department? He's a family friend. Another hesitation. I'm not sure I remember that name. It was a large program? Daniel was frowning now, his physician's instincts clearly picking up on something off about Claire's responses. Honey, didn't you tell me you studied pre-med at Stanford? That's why you understand the medical field so well. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke. Liberal arts or pre-med? It couldn't be both. Claire laughed nervously. Well, I started in liberal arts but moved toward pre-med coursework. Very interdisciplinary approach. That's interesting, Dr. Williams said. What year did you graduate? I might know some of your professors from the medical school connections. The moment when Claire's web of lies would begin to completely unravel. It was a few years ago, Claire said vaguely. You know how time flies. But Daniel wasn't letting it go. Claire, what year exactly? We've talked about your college experience, but I realize you've never been specific about dates. I watched my sister's face cycle through several emotions: panic, calculation, and finally resignation. She was trapped between her husband's growing suspicion and a room full of doctors who actually knew the academic program she was claiming to have completed. Daniel, maybe we should save the academic discussions for later, she said, forcing lightness into her voice. It's our wedding day, after all. But Daniel's expression had changed. The loving husband was gone, replaced by the analytical physician who'd built his career on asking the right questions and recognizing when answers didn't add up. You know, he said slowly, I just realized I've never seen your Stanford diploma. It's not hanging in your office at the clinic like Dad's medical degrees. Claire's laugh was high and brittle. Oh, it's packed away somewhere. You know how I am with keeping track of papers. The lie was so obvious that even the doctors, trained to be diplomatically polite, were beginning to look uncomfortable. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. Well, regardless of academic backgrounds, it's clear both Bennett sisters have found success in their respective fields. Family talent seems to run strong. It was a gracious attempt to smooth over the growing tension, but Daniel wasn't ready to let it go. Claire, he said, his voice taking on the firm tone I'd heard him use with difficult patience, what do you actually do at the family clinic? I've noticed you're always vague about your specific responsibilities. The question hit Claire like a physical blow. I watched her struggle to find an answer that wouldn't expose whatever truth she'd been hiding. I help with patient relations, administrative duties, keeping everything running smoothly. Administrative duties, Daniel repeated flatly. Are you saying you're essentially a receptionist? The word receptionist landed in the conversation like a bomb. Claire's face flushed red. I do much more than that. I handle complex patient interactions, coordinate with insurance companies, manage scheduling. Receptionist duties, Daniel said, his voice growing colder. Claire, when we met, you told me you were a medical professional. You said you had clinical training. I do understand the medical field, Claire protested weakly. Working in the clinic, you learn so much. Working in the clinic as what? Daniel pressed. Because actual medical professionals have specific training, specific degrees, specific certifications. What are your credentials exactly? The silence that followed was so uncomfortable that the doctors began excusing themselves, clearly sensing a domestic dispute brewing. Dr. Harrison muttered something about checking on his wife, while Dr. Williams suddenly remembered an urgent phone call he needed to make. Within 30 seconds, it was just the three of us, the bride, the groom, and the sister whose very presence was dismantling a marriage. What Daniel said next would shatter the last of Claire's pretenses. Claire, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, I want you to answer a very simple question. Did you actually graduate from Stanford? The question hung between them like an unexploded bomb. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for Claire's response. Daniel, this isn't the time or place. Did you graduate from Stanford? He repeated, each word carefully enunciated. Claire looked around desperately, perhaps hoping for rescue, but the cocktail area had largely emptied as guests moved toward the dining room for dinner. It was just the three of us in this bubble of tension. It's complicated, she said finally. No, Daniel replied, it's not complicated. Either you have a degree from Stanford University or you don't. Either you told me the truth about your education, or you've been lying to me for the past 2 years, the moment when 11 years of family lies would finally be exposed. Claire's shoulders sagged in defeat. I didn't graduate. The confession was barely above a whisper, but it hit Daniel like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, his face cycling through shock, hurt, and growing anger. You didn't graduate, he repeated. What does that mean exactly? I attended Stanford for 2 years, Claire said, the words coming out in a rush. But the coursework was harder than I expected, and I was struggling financially, and I made some poor choices. You dropped out, Daniel said flatly. I took a leave of absence that became permanent, Claire corrected weakly. A leave of absence. Daniel's voice was getting louder. Claire, you told me you had a degree from Stanford. You told me you understood medicine. You told me you were qualified to work in a medical setting. I am qualified, Claire protested. I've been working at the clinic for 3 years. I know the patients. I understand the procedures. You're a receptionist, Daniel said, the word dripping with disgust. You're a college dropout working as a receptionist, and you've been lying about it for our entire relationship. The pain in Daniel's voice was heartbreaking, but what he revealed next would make everything even worse. My parents, he continued, his voice breaking slightly, my parents have been telling their friends that I married a Stanford graduate. They've been bragging about your education to their country club friends. They introduced you to the hospital board as someone with medical training. Claire winced. I never said I had medical training. You let them believe it, Daniel exploded. You stood there while they introduced you as someone with a Stanford education and clinical experience, and you said nothing. I found myself in the awkward position of witnessing the complete breakdown of my sister's marriage at her own wedding. Part of me felt guilty for being the catalyst, but a larger part recognized that this Confrontation was inevitable. The truth has a way of surfacing, and building a relationship on lies was never sustainable. Daniel, Claire pleaded, reaching for his hand, I can explain everything. Yes, I made mistakes when I was younger, but that doesn't define who I am now. He pulled his hand away. Doesn't it? Claire, you've been lying to me about fundamental aspects of your life, your education, your career qualifications, your family background. My family background? Claire looked confused. Daniel turned to look at me, his expression a mixture of respect and growing understanding. Your sister is a self-made millionaire with an MIT education who built a revolutionary medical technology company. Meanwhile, you're a college dropout working as a receptionist, but you told me Sophia was the family disappointment. The final piece of Claire's narrative crumbling in real time. You told your husband I was the disappointment? I asked quietly. Claire's face flushed with shame. When Daniel and I first started dating, I may have embellished some details about our family dynamics. Embellished, I repeated. Claire, what exactly did you tell him about me? She couldn't meet my eyes. I said you'd made poor life choices, that you were struggling financially and professionally, that Mom and Dad were worried about your direction in life. Daniel stared at his bride with growing horror. You told me your sister was a burden on your family. You said she'd never amounted to anything, and that's why she wasn't involved in your life anymore. Every word of that was a lie, I said simply. Mom and Dad threw me out when I was 21 because they needed my college fund to pay for Claire's Stanford education, which, as it turns out, she never even completed. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow, and what he said next would seal the fate of this marriage. You've been lying about everything, he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. Your education, your career, your family, your sister. What else have you lied about, Claire? Before Claire could answer, the wedding coordinator appeared, smiling brightly despite the obvious tension. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, we're ready to seat everyone for dinner. The photographer wants to get some shots of you entering the reception together. Daniel looked at the coordinator, then at Claire, then at me. I need some air, he said finally, and walked away, leaving his bride standing in her wedding dress in the middle of her reception, with only her disowned sister for company. If this complete meltdown of Claire's perfect wedding has you hooked, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will show you that sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It destroys everything you've built on lies. The wedding coordinator looked between Claire and me, clearly trying to process what she'd walked into. Is everything all right? She asked diplomatically. Should I delay the dinner service? Claire stood, frozen in her designer wedding dress, mascara starting to smudge slightly despite the waterproof claims. The bride who'd looked so radiant an hour ago now looked lost and small. Give us a few minutes, I told the coordinator. Family conversation. After she left, Claire finally looked at me directly for the first time all evening. Are you happy now? She asked, her voice bitter. You've destroyed my wedding. I didn't destroy anything, Claire, I replied calmly. I just existed. The lies you built your relationship on did the rest. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right. You just happened to show up after 11 years, just happened to mention your MIT education and your $400 million company. Pure coincidence. I came because you invited me, I said. You sent the invitation to my company. You wanted Sophia Bennett, CEO of Medova Technologies, at your wedding. You just didn't expect her to actually show up. The truth of that statement hit Claire like a physical blow. You knew, she whispered. You knew exactly who you were inviting. I knew you'd been following my success through news articles and industry publications. I knew you'd been dropping hints to Daniel about your successful entrepreneur sister. What I didn't know was that you'd been lying about your own accomplishments. Claire sank onto a nearby chair, her expensive dress pooling around her like spilled milk. What am I supposed to do now? My marriage is over before it even began. Maybe, I said, sitting down across from her. You start with the truth about everything. The truth? Claire laughed bitterly. The truth is that I'm exactly what Daniel said, a college dropout working as a receptionist. The truth is that I've been living in your shadow my entire life, even when you weren't around. The admission was more honest than anything Claire had said all evening. You weren't living in my shadow, I said gently. You were living in a fantasy where you got to have both the advantages our parents gave you and the success I earned myself. But it wasn't fair, Claire burst out. You were always the smart one, the driven one. Even when Mom and Dad chose me, I knew they were making the wrong choice. And then when you succeeded anyway, despite everything they did to hold you back, she trailed off, tears starting to flow freely now. Claire, I said carefully, did you really think I'd failed? All these years, did you actually believe your own story about me being a disappointment? She shook her head slowly. I knew you'd done well. I Googled you occasionally, saw the articles about Moldova, but I told myself it wasn't real success, that you were just lucky, that it wouldn't last. Because admitting I'd succeeded meant admitting our parents were wrong about me? Because admitting you'd succeeded meant admitting I'd wasted every advantage they gave me. The raw honesty was more than I'd gotten from my family in 11 years. Before I could respond, Daniel reappeared, his face set in grim determination. He'd clearly used his time outside to think, and the conclusion he'd reached was written in his expression. Claire, he said without preamble, we need to talk privately. I started to stand, but Claire grabbed my hand. No, she said, stay, please. I think I need a witness to make sure I tell the truth this time. Daniel looked surprised, but nodded. Fine. Claire, I need you to answer some questions, and I need you to be completely honest. Can you do that? Claire nodded, wiping her eyes. Did you graduate from any college? No. Do you have any medical training beyond what you've picked up working as a receptionist? No. Have you been lying to me about your education and qualifications for the entire time we've known each other? Yes. Each answer hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he pressed on. What else have you lied about? Claire looked at me, then back at Daniel. I lied about Sophia, about why she wasn't in my life, about her success, about our family dynamics. Our parents didn't disapprove of her choices. They threw her out to fund my education, which I then wasted. Daniel closed his eyes, absorbing the full scope of the deception. When he opened them again, his expression was resolved. I can't do this, Claire, he said quietly. I can't build a marriage with someone who's been lying to me about fundamental aspects of her life. Daniel, please, Claire begged. We can work through this. I'll be honest from now on. We can start over. Start over? Daniel shook his head. Claire, my parents just met your extended family. My colleagues just learned about your sister's incredible success while believing you were equally accomplished. How do I explain to everyone that my wife has been lying about everything? The social humiliation aspect was clearly weighing heavily on Daniel, and what he said next would end any chance of reconciliation. More than that, he continued, how do I trust you about anything going forward? If you could lie about something as basic as your education, what else are you capable of lying about? Claire had no answer for that. Daniel turned to me. Sophia, I owe you an apology. Claire painted a picture of you that was completely false, and I bought into it without question. You had no reason to question your wife, I replied diplomatically. Didn't I? Daniel asked. Looking back, there were signs. The way she was vague about her Stanford experience, the way she couldn't answer specific questions about her coursework, the way she seemed threatened whenever medical professionals talked about their education. He turned back to Claire. I'm going home. I need time to think about what this means for us. What about the reception? Claire asked desperately. What about our guests? You figure it out, Daniel said coldly. You're good at making up stories. I'm sure you'll think of something. And with that, He walked away, leaving Claire alone in her wedding dress, with the sister she'd spent 11 years lying about. The reception continued around us, guests gradually realizing something was wrong, but too polite to ask directly. Claire sat in stunned silence, occasionally wiping away tears that kept threatening to fall. "What happens now?" she asked finally. I looked at my sister, this woman who'd been given every advantage I'd been denied, but had squandered it all on lies and pretense. "Now," I said, "you decide who you want to be. The person who builds a life on truth, or the person who keeps running from it. Because sometimes the most successful revenge is simply being yourself and letting the truth speak for itself." The reception dragged on like a surreal nightmare. Guests mingled and danced, blissfully unaware that the groom had walked out on his bride. Claire managed to pull herself together enough to make an appearance, claiming Daniel had fallen ill and gone home to rest. The lie came so easily to her that I wondered how many others she'd told over the years. I stayed until the end, partly out of morbid curiosity, and partly because I felt responsible for the chaos I'd inadvertently caused. As the last guest filtered out, thanking Claire for a lovely evening and wishing her well, I helped her gather the wedding gifts that would likely be returned within the week. "Sophia," she said as we loaded boxes into her car, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you hate me?" The question that would determine whether our family could ever heal from 11 years of lies and resentment. I considered my answer carefully. "No, Claire, I don't hate you, but I don't trust you either." She nodded, accepting the honesty. "Fair enough. What you said earlier about deciding who I want to be, what did you mean?" "I meant you have a choice. You can keep living the fantasy where you're a victim of circumstances, or you can take responsibility for your choices and build something real. Like you did?" "I didn't have a choice," I said. "When our parents threw me out, I could either succeed or fail. There was no middle ground, no safety net, no second chances. You've had safety nets your whole life. Maybe it's time to see what you can accomplish without them." 3 weeks later, I received a call that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I was in my office, reviewing quarterly reports from our European division, when my assistant announced that Daniel Parker was on the line. I hadn't heard from him since the wedding disaster, and frankly, I'd assumed he and Claire had either reconciled or quietly divorced. "Daniel," I said, picking up the phone, "this is unexpected." "Sophia, I need to talk to you. In person, if possible. It's about Claire, but it's also about something bigger." There was an urgency in his voice that made me sit up straighter. "What kind of bigger?" "The kind that involves federal investigators and your parents' medical practice." The words that would reveal my family's corruption went far deeper than academic lies. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Boston, neutral territory, where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from either of our families. Daniel looked terrible, exhausted, stressed, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. "Before I tell you what I've discovered," he began, "I need you to know that Claire and I are getting divorced. The marriage was annulled, actually, fraud in the inducement, lying about fundamental aspects of her identity, voided the contract." I nodded. "I'm sorry it came to that." "I'm not," Daniel said firmly. "What I'm sorry about is what I've learned since the wedding. Sophia, your parents aren't just enablers of Claire's lies, they're criminals." The coffee shop suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. "What do you mean?" Daniel pulled out a thick manila folder. After the wedding, I couldn't stop thinking about the inconsistencies in Claire's story, so I started looking into the family clinic where she works. He opened the folder, revealing what looked like financial documents and medical records. "Your parents have been running a Medicare fraud scheme for at least 3 years. They bill for procedures they never perform, inflate the complexity of simple treatments, and file claims for patients who were never seen by a doctor." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, but there was more. Claire isn't just a receptionist, Sophia. She's the one who handles the fraudulent billing. She inputs the false codes, submits the claims, and processes the payments. She's been actively participating in stealing from Medicare. I stared at the documents, my successful, orderly world suddenly feeling unstable. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate? About $2 million over 3 years? The number hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Daniel, I said carefully, why are you telling me this? And why do you have these documents? Because I was supposed to be their next recruit, he said bitterly. Your father approached me 2 days after the wedding. He said he understood I was upset about Claire's lies, but that there were financial opportunities that could make our marriage worthwhile despite the deception. The attempt to corrupt Daniel would prove to be my parents' biggest mistake. He offered you money to stay married to Claire? He offered me a partnership in the clinic with the understanding that I would help expand their billing efficiency. When I asked what that meant, he showed me exactly how they were defrauding Medicare. Daniel's voice was thick with disgust. He actually bragged about it, Sophia, said they'd been doing it for years, that Claire was instrumental in the operation, and that with my medical credentials, they could expand into more sophisticated fraud. I felt sick. What did you do? I recorded the conversation, Daniel said, pulling out his phone. Want to hear? The recording that would destroy my parents' lives and reveal the true cost of their choices. Daniel pressed play, and I heard my father's voice, clear and unmistakable, explaining in detail how they billed Medicare for cardiac procedures that were never performed, how they inflated diagnosis codes to maximize payments, and how Claire's computer skills made the fraud nearly undetectable. The beauty of it, my father's voice said on the recording, is that Medicare rarely audits small practices like ours. And even if they do, Claire has become expert at creating documentation that supports our claims. Daniel's voice on the recording was carefully neutral. What about the ethical implications? These are taxpayer funds meant to help elderly patients. My father actually laughed. Daniel, you're thinking like an idealist. This is business. The government wastes billions of dollars every year. We're just redirecting a tiny fraction of that waste into productive hands. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, detailing the scope of the fraud and my parents' plans to expand it. By the time it ended, I felt nauseous. I've given copies of this to the FBI, Daniel said quietly. The investigation is already underway. But what Daniel told me next would force me to confront the most painful truth of all. Sophia, there's something else. The reason your parents took your college fund wasn't just to pay for Claire's Stanford education. I looked up at him, dreading what was coming next. They took it to cover gambling debts your father had accumulated. Claire's tuition was paid for with money stolen from Medicare. They threw you out because they needed someone to blame for the family's financial problems, and the college fund theft was just a convenient cover story. The revelation that my entire exile was based on a lie would reshape everything I thought I knew about my family. Gambling debts? Daniel nodded grimly. According to the financial records I've uncovered, your father has a serious gambling addiction. He's been stealing from the clinic's legitimate revenue for years to cover his losses. The Medicare fraud was originally started to replace the money he'd stolen from legitimate operations. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed. So Claire knew about the gambling, too? Claire knew about everything. The gambling, the theft of your college fund, the Medicare fraud. She's not a victim, Sophia. She's been an active participant in covering up your father's crimes and profiting from them. The coffee shop around us faded into background noise as I processed this information. My parents weren't just flawed people who'd made bad choices. They were criminals who'd destroyed their daughter's future to cover their crimes. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Because the FBI wants to interview you. The words that would force me to decide between family loyalty and justice. They think I'm involved? No, Daniel said quickly. They think You might be willing to testify about your parents' behavior patterns, about the family financial situation when you were younger, about any knowledge you might have of irregular income sources. I thought about that for a moment. What happens if I refuse to cooperate? Nothing happens to you, but your parents and Claire will probably receive lighter sentences because the prosecution's case will be weaker without family testimony. And if I do cooperate, they'll likely face federal charges for Medicare fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Claire could be looking at 5 to 10 years in prison. The choice between protecting the family that had destroyed me and seeking justice for their victims. I looked at Daniel, this man who'd been willing to blow up his own life to expose corruption. "What would you do?" "I've already done it," he said simply. "I reported crimes that I discovered, but your situation is different. These are your parents, your sister. I can't make that choice for you." I thought about the employees whose pension funds the Ashfords had stolen, about the elderly patients whose Medicare benefits were being defrauded, about the young woman I'd been who lost her future to cover my father's gambling debts. When do they want to meet? 2 weeks later, I sat in a federal building in Boston, facing FBI investigators who treated me with the careful respect reserved for potential witnesses rather than suspects. Agent Sarah Martinez was a woman about my age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Agent David Chen was older, more experienced, and clearly the lead investigator. "Ms. Bennett," Agent Martinez began, "we appreciate you coming in voluntarily. We understand this must be difficult, given the family relationships involved." "I want to help," I said simply, "but I need to understand exactly what you're asking of me." Agent Chen opened a file folder. "We'd like you to provide testimony about your family's financial situation during your youth, particularly around the time you were asked to leave the family home. The questions that would force me to relive the most painful period of my life for the sake of justice." "They didn't ask me to leave," I corrected. "They threw me out. There's a difference. Can you tell us about the circumstances leading up to that decision?" I took a deep breath and began the story I'd spent 11 years trying to forget. The gambling that started when I was in high school, the increasing arguments about money, the discovery that my college fund had been emptied, the accusation that I was ungrateful and selfish for expecting my parents to fund my education. "Did you ever see evidence of unusual income sources in the family home?" Agent Martinez asked. I thought carefully. "My father always had cash, more cash than made sense for a small-town doctor's legitimate income, and there were expensive purchases that seemed out of proportion to the practice's size." "What kind of purchases?" "My mother's jewelry collection, my father's sports car, Claire's private school tuition, her designer clothes, the family vacations. It all seemed excessive for what the clinic should have been generating." Agent Chen leaned forward. "Were you ever told where this additional income came from?" "My parents always said the practice was doing well, that they were good at managing money. I believed them until I got older and understood more about medical practice economics." The testimony continued for 3 hours, covering everything from my father's gambling habits to Claire's involvement in the clinic's operations. "Ms. Bennett," Agent Martinez said as we wrapped up, "is there anything else you think we should know about your family's financial practices?" I hesitated, then decided full truth was the only way forward. "There's something else about why they threw me out. It wasn't just about the college fund." Both agents looked up with increased attention. I had started asking questions about the family's finances. I was 18, planning for college, and I wanted to understand how much financial aid I would need. When I asked to see the clinic's books to understand our family income, my father became furious. "What kind of questions were you asking?" I wanted to know why we had so much cash, but the clinic's reported income seemed modest. I asked about the discrepancy between our lifestyle and what I could find in public records about typical medical practice revenues. Agent Chen made notes. "And your father's response?" He accused me of being ungrateful and suspicious. He said I was trying to interfere with business operations I didn't understand. Looking back, I think I was getting too close to discovering the fraud. The realization that I'd been exiled not just for family dysfunction, but for threatening to expose their crimes. So your exile served multiple purposes, Agent Martinez observed. It removed a potential witness, eliminated someone asking uncomfortable questions, and provided a scapegoat for the family's financial problems. That's exactly right, I said, and it worked perfectly. For 11 years, I believed I was the problem. After the interview, I sat in my car in the federal building's parking garage, emotionally exhausted. My phone rang. It was Claire. "Sophia," her voice was small and scared. "I know you met with the FBI. Daniel told me." "Claire." "I don't blame you," she interrupted. "I know what we did was wrong. What I did was wrong." The conversation that would determine whether Claire could find redemption or remain lost in her family's corruption. "Do you actually understand what you did?" I asked. "Or are you just scared of going to prison?" There was a long pause. "Both," she admitted. "But mostly I understand now. Working with Daniel's lawyer to prepare for the divorce, going through all the financial records, seeing it all laid out objectively. Sophia, we stole millions of dollars from a program meant to help sick, elderly people." "Yes, you did. I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson, this elderly woman who comes to the clinic for her heart condition. She's always worried about whether Medicare will cover her treatments, whether she can afford her medications. And I've been sitting there processing fraudulent claims that steal money from the program that's supposed to help her." The genuine remorse in Claire's voice was something I'd never heard before. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to cooperate fully with the investigation. I'm going to plead guilty to whatever charges they bring, and I'm going to try to make amends somehow, even if it takes the rest of my life." The words that would begin Claire's long journey toward redemption. "Claire, that's going to mean prison time." "I know, and I deserve it. But Sophia, there's something else I need to tell you." "What?" "I've been following your company's charitable foundation, the scholarship program you started for students from troubled family backgrounds. I want to contribute to it." I was genuinely surprised. "Claire, you're about to face federal charges. You'll need money for legal fees." "I've been saving money from the fraudulent billing for 3 years. I have about $200,000 that I should never have had. I want to give it to your foundation." The gesture that would prove Claire was finally ready to face the truth about her choices. "That money will be seized as proceeds of crime," I pointed out. "Then I'll give them information about where every penny is, and I'll ask that it be donated to your foundation as restitution. I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can help other kids who are thrown away by their families the way you were." For the first time in 11 years, I heard my sister speaking with genuine honesty and selflessness. "Claire, are you sure about this? Cooperation and restitution might help your case, but you're still looking at serious prison time." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I want to do the right thing because it's right, not because it benefits me." 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Boston was packed for the sentencing hearing. My parents had pled guilty to conspiracy to commit Medicare fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Claire had pled guilty to the same charges, but her cooperation with investigators and voluntary restitution had earned her a reduced sentence recommendation. I sat in the gallery watching as my father received 8 years in federal prison and my mother received 6. Claire, despite her cooperation, received 4 years due to her extensive involvement in the scheme. But what happened during Claire's sentencing would provide a glimpse of the person she might become. "Your Honor," Claire said when given the opportunity to address the court, "I want to apologize not just to the court and to the taxpayers whose money we stole, but specifically to my sister Sophia Bennett." She turned to look at me in the gallery. 11 years ago, our family threw Sophia out rather than face the truth about our financial crimes. We blamed her for problems we created. We stole her future to fund our lies. And then I spent the next decade lying about her success, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging how wrong we'd been. The public apology that I'd waited 11 years to hear. Sophia built a $400 million company and became a leader in medical technology while I was stealing money from programs designed to help patients. She succeeded despite our betrayal, not because of our support. Claire's voice broke slightly. I can't undo the damage our family did to her, but I can make sure everyone knows the truth. Sophia Bennett is everything our parents said she'd never become, and she achieved it all without the advantages they denied her. The judge, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, listened carefully to Claire's statement. Ms. Parker, Judge Williams said, while I appreciate your acknowledgement of responsibility, I want to make sure the court understands the scope of your crimes. You didn't just steal money from a government program. You stole from a system designed to provide health care to our most vulnerable citizens. I understand, Your Honor, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. Your cooperation with investigators and your voluntary restitution demonstrate genuine remorse. However, the crimes you committed over 3 years require significant punishment. The sentence that would determine Claire's future and her chance for redemption. I hereby sentence you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service to be served at medical facilities providing care to Medicare patients. After the sentencing, Claire was led away in handcuffs, but before she left, she caught my eye and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. 3 years later, I received a letter that would test whether forgiveness was possible. The envelope arrived at my office, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution where Claire was serving her sentence. Her handwriting was neater than I remembered, more careful. Dear Sophia, I know I have no right to expect a response to this letter, but I wanted you to know what I've been doing with my time here. I've been working in the prison medical clinic, helping elderly inmates navigate Medicare paperwork and understand their health care rights. It's taught me exactly how much damage our fraud did to real people. I've also completed my bachelor's degree through the prison education program. It took me 15 years, but I finally have a legitimate college education. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in healthcare administration. When I'm released next year, I want to dedicate my life to healthcare advocacy for elderly and disadvantaged patients. I know I can never fully atone for what I did, but I want to spend the rest of my life protecting the system I helped damage. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect a relationship, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand the person you always were, and I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your sister. With love and respect, Claire. If this journey of family destruction and potential redemption has kept you captivated, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what I decided to do with Claire's letter will show you that sometimes the most powerful revenge is helping someone become better than they were. I read the letter 3 times, then set it aside and returned to work. But that evening, as I sat in my penthouse apartment overlooking the Boston skyline, I found myself thinking about the woman Claire was trying to become. A year later, Claire was released from prison. She didn't contact me directly, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd found work at a nonprofit organization that helped elderly patients navigate Medicare benefits and protect themselves from fraud. 6 months after that, I saw her at a medical conference where I was delivering the keynote address about innovation in healthcare technology. She was sitting in the back row, wearing a simple professional outfit, taking careful notes. When our eyes met, she smiled sadly and nodded, then quietly left the auditorium. The moment when I had to decide whether redemption was possible for someone who'd caused so much damage. 2 weeks later, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the nonprofit where Claire worked and spoke to the director. I understand you have a Claire Parker working in your Medicare advocacy program, I said. Yes, the director replied. She's actually one of our most effective advocates. Her understanding of healthcare billing and Medicare procedures is extraordinary. May I ask who's calling? This is Sophia Bennett, CEO of Medova Technologies. I'd like to discuss a potential partnership between our organizations. The meeting took place in neutral territory, a conference room at the nonprofit's headquarters. Claire looked older, humbled by her experiences, but somehow more genuine than I'd ever seen her. Sophia, she said quietly, I don't expect anything from you. If this partnership benefits the organization, I'm happy about that. But I don't want you to think I'm trying to use our relationship for personal gain. I know you're not, I said. I've been watching what you've been doing. The work speaks for itself. The conversation that would determine whether healing was possible after years of lies and betrayal. Claire, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always, she said, and I believed her. If you could go back and change things, not just the fraud, but the way our family treated me, would you? Claire was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said finally, but not because I regret the consequences for myself. I'd change it because I understand now what we stole from you. Not just the money, not just the opportunities, but the family support you deserved. And what would you have done differently? I would have stood up to our parents when they blamed you for their problems. I would have acknowledged your achievements instead of diminishing them. I would have been the sister you deserved instead of the sister who benefited from your exile. The apology that finally addressed the real damage that had been done. Claire, I said carefully, I'm not ready to have a sister relationship with you. The trust is gone, and trust takes time to rebuild. I understand. But I am willing to have a professional relationship. Medova Technologies is launching a new program to help elderly patients understand and navigate medical billing. Your expertise in both the fraud side and the advocacy side makes you uniquely qualified to lead that program. Claire's eyes widened. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you the chance to earn a job. You'd start as a consultant, work on a trial basis, prove that you can be trusted with responsibility. If the trial period goes well, we'd discuss permanent employment. The opportunity for Claire to rebuild her life through honest work and genuine contribution. Sophia, I don't deserve this. It's not about what you deserve, I replied. It's about what our patients deserve. They deserve someone who understands fraud from the inside and is committed to preventing it. They deserve someone who's learned the cost of dishonesty and chosen truth instead. Claire wiped away tears she'd been trying to hold back. What would I need to do? Start by helping us develop training materials for healthcare providers about billing fraud detection. Use your experience to help honest doctors protect themselves from accidentally falling into fraudulent patterns. Turn your knowledge of how the system can be abused into knowledge of how it can be protected. And personally, between us, I considered the question carefully. Personally, I think redemption is possible for people who do the hard work of changing. You've started that work. Whether you continue it is up to you. 5 years later, Claire had become one of the most respected Medicare fraud prevention experts in the country. Her presentation at the National Healthcare Billing Conference drew standing ovations from an audience of medical professionals who appreciated her unique perspective as both former perpetrator and current protector of healthcare billing integrity. I watched from the audience as she concluded her speech. I spent 3 years stealing from Medicare, and I spent 4 years in federal prison for those crimes. But I've spent the last 5 years learning that the most powerful way to atone for damage is to become someone who prevents others from making the same mistakes. The transformation that proved people can change, if they're willing to do the hard work of becoming better. After her presentation, we had dinner together, not as sisters, but as colleagues who respected each other's professional work. Claire had earned the trust I'd been unwilling to give her years earlier. Do you think our parents will ever understand what they did? she asked as we finished our meal. I think Dad might, eventually. Prison has a way of forcing people to confront reality. Mom, I shrugged. She spent her whole life avoiding uncomfortable truths. I doubt prison will change that. Have you visited them? No, and I don't plan to. They made their choices, and I've made mine. Claire nodded, understanding. I visit Dad sometimes. He asks about you. What do you tell him? I tell him the truth, that you built an empire while we were building lies, that you became everything they said you'd never be, that throwing you out was the worst mistake our family ever made. The acknowledgement that came too late to change the past, but might influence the future. And what does he say? Claire smiled sadly. He says he's proud of you, finally. I considered that for a moment. It's nice to hear, but it doesn't change anything. Pride without support, without sacrifice, without standing up for someone when it matters. That's just words. I know, Claire said. That's why I've tried to show my respect through actions instead of just words. As we parted ways that evening, Claire turned back one final time. Sophia, I know we'll never be sisters the way we might have been, but I want you to know that working for Moldova, helping protect the healthcare system I once damaged, it's the most meaningful work I've ever done. Good, I replied, because it's the most important work you'll ever do. The story could end there, with professional respect replacing family bonds, with redemption earned through service rather than demanded through blood relation. But life, I've learned, is more complex than neat endings. Today, Claire and I work together professionally. We're cordial, respectful, and effective collaborators. She saved Medicare millions of dollars through her fraud prevention work, and she's helped hundreds of elderly patients understand their rights and protections. Is she my sister? Biologically, yes. Emotionally, we're something new. Two people who share a damaged history, but have chosen to build something constructive from the wreckage. The lesson that revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, but about building something so meaningful that their approval becomes irrelevant. When people ask if I've forgiven my family, I tell them forgiveness isn't the point. The point is building a life so successful, so meaningful, so connected to real purpose that the people who rejected you become footnotes in your story rather than the authors of it. My parents spent 11 years believing they'd discarded their worthless daughter. Instead, they'd freed her to become someone they could never have imagined. That's not revenge. That's justice. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, justice creates space for redemption, not for the people who wronged you, but for the person you become in spite of them. If this story of family betrayal, personal triumph, and earned redemption has kept you riveted until the very end, absolutely demolish that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of people who turned their pain into power. Drop a comment about which moment hit you hardest, because everyone deserves to know that being rejected by the wrong people can be the first step toward finding the right life.